Okay, it's a pleasure to be here, and I wanted to begin this talk, which is basically talking about how two agencies, American agencies, regulate, but I'll make a pitch for the interest of the way that these two agencies do their regulation to this particular audience by quoting from the 17th of August peer review by the Financial Stability Board of the Indian financial sector regulatory process. And that process, the Financial Stability Board, and we'll hear more about them later in my talk, focused on two things that it thought that could be improved about the Indian regulatory process. The first involved its approach to macroprudential questions of just systemic stability. And the second focused on the regulation of non-bank financial institutions. And so, for example, the peer review report said, quote, the regulatory perimeter for NBFCs is based on the principal business criteria used by the RBI to define if an institution that engages in financial activities should be registered with it. There is a need to continuously review the perimeter to ensure that the threshold remains appropriate and does not give rise to perverse incentives or encourage risky activities through regulatory arbitrage. So that's one concern, an active concern right now, is what do we do about non-banks, given that we have a regulatory approach for banks and an increasingly vibrant shadow banking sector that meets many of the same functions of banks without being regulated like banks. The Financial Stability Board has answered this question by saying, well, that for some non-banks, globally, systemically important insurers, we'll create special rules for these firms to make sure that they're adequately capitalized to withstand a shock or a crisis. And so these are the surcharges that the Financial Stability Board has suggested should be applied. And it's also created a list of globally systemically important insurers who meet this criteria of risky, systemically risky, and so suitable for extra supervision and extra capital requirements. And three of the firms on the list are American insurers. So this has created a problem within the United States regulatory process. And the first thing that I want to talk about, consistent with the time requirements that we've got, is to talk about the way that America has resolved this question of what to do about non-bank financial companies and their riskiness. On the one hand, what we have is an approach to non-bank financial companies that can be subject to bank-like supervision. And those companies will do almost anything to avoid that supervision. So one company that was designated was General Electric Capital. And you can't see too well from this chart, but it really changed its business model. And the chart is an approach to how it basically got out of runnable assets, like runnable liabilities, commercial paper. You can see how when it was designated for extra supervision, it decided to become a different sort of financial institution altogether. And the second approach was taken by MetLife, which is America's largest insurance company. And there it is with a dart in it. MetLife advertises at football and baseball games by flying a blimp around, which was brought down by the Financial Stability Board. It responded by suing. So this process of regulating non-bank financial companies more like banks has occasioned a lot of critics in the United States. So the chair of the Senate Banking Committee, worried about international influence on American regulation, wondered whether the American designation of non-bank financial institutions for extra supervision was sufficiently free from the influence of outside organizations. And the inclination was, why are we taking orders from the Financial Stability Board, a shadowy network of global regulators that we participate in but do not control? The Republican Party has called for the repeal of the oversight of non-bank financial institutions, and a court has held that the designation of MetLife was arbitrary and capricious, and that's a case that is now up for appeal. And the concern among all of these critics with different sorts of government power has been that designation as systemically significant as an insurance company or a firm like GE Capital is like the Hotel California of the Eagles song. Once you check in, you can never leave. So this paper that I've done with Dan Schwartz, who's an insurance scholar at the University of Minnesota, basically talks about the way that the council designation of non-banks is gone. And then we talk about it on two levels. One is a basic policy question of, is this appropriate administrative procedure being followed? And I think it's an interesting contrast because here I will be pushing for discretion, and we just heard about how in India there's a concern that rules and processes of consultation are not being followed. So what the government did in the United States was they took 4 firms, the 3 largest insurers and General Electric Capital, and it said, we're going to start regulating you like a bank. It also rejected designations of some large insurers like Berkshire Hathaway. That's the firm owned by Warren Buffett. And it considered designating, but has not done so, asset managers like BlackRock and Vanguard. These are firms that increasingly hold a large proportion of basic American retirement accounts and savings. Also designated were financial market utilities. And so these are the list of firms that in the United States are considered to be systemically risky enough to be suitable for bank-like treatment. And the question is, given the criticism of the way that the council has done this designation, is there a defense to what happened? And on a basic level, we think it's pretty clear that as a matter of appropriate administrative procedure, what the council has done is fine. It has rejected the use of quantitative standards and a cost-benefit analysis before designating each firm. But we think that it has the discretion to do that because there is a great deal of flexibility and yet guidance given to it by the Dodd-Frank statute, which created this designation process. So Congress identified 10 factors, and one of those factors is literally any other factor that the council determines was worth consideration. And the council took those 10 factors seriously enough and sort of combined them into a list of 6 and created a 3-step process, which involves participation by the potential target for designation. And this is a system in which there is basically some outlining of the standards that will be used to designate banks, and or non-banks, and some flexibility retained by the government to tailor those designations in the future. We think there's a lot of good reasons for some discretion to be retained, and some of those reasons are set up here. The malleability of a standard and the refusal to do a cost-benefit analysis in every case disincentivizes financial firms from taking systemic risk. There's not too much uncertainty. There are areas and certain firms that cannot be designated under this system. Firms must be, does that say 5 or 2? 2, okay. Moving along, but not so many of them. And then finally, what we've seen in this designation process is that insurance firms are changing their business model. So AIG last year considered breaking itself up. MetLife sued, and so far sued successfully, but it also looked to get rid of its variable annuities business. And we think that those are systemically risky things. And finally, more to the point, finally on this issue, and then I'll move very quickly to look at the Fed. The idea that a regulator might occasionally threaten a firm and therefore scare an industry into compliance, we think that that sounds like the definition of arbitrariness by the government is defensible in certain cases, particularly when uncertainty is high, and the fact is regulators do not know where the next source of systemic risk is going to come from. And the downside risk is extreme. Cass Sunstein suggested that this was an appropriate time for precautionary regulation, and we think that the council, in its regulation of non-bank financial firms, is engaged in that sort of regulation. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to talk about was the supervisor who does this sort of regulation, and that's the Fed. And this is a pivot, and it's a pivot that I will do in 1 minute. But it's a pivot to observe that the Fed is a strange regulator. It has a great deal of independence, and one of the ways it's exercised this independence is by interacting with its foreign counterparts. And one of the most interesting things about the Fed's foreign counterpart regulation has been that there's been this blend of cosmopolitanism, i.e. it participates in the Financial Stability Board, and appears to, along with the other American financial regulators, take direction from the Financial Stability Board on, for example, what kind of non-bank financial firms are systemically risky. It's a cosmopolitan approach to regulation, where an American regulator that didn't have to give up regulatory power has delegated it. On the other hand, in monetary policy, the Fed often regulates in an America-first approach. And I find this to be interesting in its own way, partly because it may interest this audience. This has occasioned a big dispute with the former chair of the RBI, who thought that American monetary policy and quantitative easing, and not just American, but European approaches to this system too, were basically making war on the Indian economy. The Brazilians felt very similarly. And the Fed has said, we don't care. Our view about our international obligations are that we cooperate when it comes to regulation, and we pursue American interests when it comes to monetary policy. So that's an interestingly idiosyncratic and weird way to think about the risks and benefits of international cooperation. And I will not take the time to argue this fully, but it's worth noting that it's a very hard problem to solve. If you have an independent agency prosecuting its own foreign policy, that doesn't sound like good governance or good diplomacy. But we want the Fed to be an independent agency. And by the same token, hopefully people here still want the RBI to be an independent central bank as well. And if that's the case, then it has to have the independence to pursue international or domestic approaches when doing monetary policy and supervision. And if it doesn't have that flexibility, then it's no longer the independent agency that we like. So with that, I will point you to the paper if you want to take a look, and please do send me any comments if they come up.
Thank you.